I think you all remember in the life of David, there's a passage in 2 Samuel 15. You don't have to turn there, but 2 Samuel 15 talks about David's son Absalom and what Absalom started doing to undermine his father David's reign. He would rise early and go and stand by the gate, and when lawsuits were brought forth for a decision, he would ask what it's about, and he would say, "Look, your case seems really good to me, but, there's just nobody here who's going to judge you fairly. If I was in charge, I would judge your case fairly." And he did that for a time, and obviously trying to gain people's attention, gain people's favor. And all the while, he's planning to undermine his father's reign. It says in 2 Samuel chapter 15 and verse 12, Absalom sent for Ahithophel, and David's counselor from the city, and they offered sacrifices, and the conspiracy grew strong. And as you know, David heard about the conspiracy and fled Jerusalem. And of course, things changed around, but there was a conspiracy afoot to undermine David's reign. There are a number of other conspiracies in the Bible as well. In the kingdom of Judah, King Joash, it says his servants formed a conspiracy, and they killed him. It was a successful conspiracy against Joash. We have a conspiracy against Daniel. Remember in Daniel chapter 5, the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel because he was so successful. He was doing so well. And they sought some charge, but they realized that he's an honorable man. The only way we're going to get him is in the worship of his God. And so they asked the king to say that no one could worship any other god for 30 days. And then it says they assembled together and found Daniel praying. So there was a conspiracy against Daniel to get him in trouble. Of course, that sent him to the lion's den. It says in Acts chapter 23 and verse 12 that it says the next morning the Jews formed a conspiracy, that's the way it's worded in the New International Version, and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. So conspiracy to put Paul to death. What conspiracies can you think of in Scripture? Probably all of you can think of several additional ones. You might think of Judas conspiring with the Jewish leaders to have Christ arrested. Perhaps the ultimate conspiracy, Satan and his demons conspiring against God's governance and rebelling against God. There are a number of conspiracies in the Bible. And if you look through history, there have been a number of conspiracies as well that have been successfully pulled off. You think of famous conspiracy against Julius Caesar, where the senators stabbed him 23 times because they were fearful that Caesar's unprecedented concentration of power during his dictatorship would undermine the Roman Republic. So they conspired to put Julius Caesar to death. Sports has a number of conspiracies as well. Looking back, I was reminded of the black box scandal in which 8 members of the Chicago White Sox were found to deliberately lose the 1919 World Series against the Cincinnati Reds for money. They did that in exchange for money. There have been a number of conspiracies. You might think of the Watergate scandal. There are in the news today amazing number of conspiracies. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard the word conspiracy more often in the news and in current events than the last few months. Everything seems to be a conspiracy. And I call that, I would say that's in the category of alleged conspiracies. They may be true. They may not be true. I don't know. I guess in some cases they will have to be investigated to determine whether they are true. But it's almost as if anything and everything that the opposition party is doing or saying is a conspiracy. And they're using that word so very often. And the conspiracy against the Democrats, or the Democratic conspiracies, are believed by the Republicans, and the Republicans' conspiracies are believed by the Democrats. And what's true and what's false depends just on where your political standing is, or your ideological standing. Anymore, that seems to be the only determinant of what's true and false, is what people want to believe. What they feel is most advantageous or supportive of their own worldview. And so we have this term alternate facts. Varying narratives and what to believe becomes something that truly can be difficult in today's world sometimes. So there's alleged conspiracies all around us. There are real conspiracies, there are alleged conspiracies, and there are also conspiracy theories, and we've all been known of many of those. There is the belief, for instance, that the government is involved in an elaborate cover-up of UFOs that crashed in Roswell, New Mexico back in 1947. It's interesting that even today, over 60% of Americans believe that John F. Kennedy's assassination was the product of a conspiracy, an official cover-up. And I could go through more statistics. I found it interesting as I looked up some of the conspiracy theories. I hadn't realized that back in 1985, Coca-Cola Company was the target of some conspiracies when they introduced New Coke. Remember that? They changed the formula. New Coke came out, and suddenly there's conspiracies about what the executives at Coke are doing and why they did this. And it's interesting that I believe it was the CEO at the time mentioned that regarding all those conspiracies, they weren't so dumb to do some of that stuff, and they weren't so smart to do some of the other stuff they were accused of. So he found it interesting. But there is a conspiracy that under the Denver International Airport is an underground city, which is the headquarters of the New World Order. I don't know if you knew about that one. That was a new one to me. Through the centuries, there have been conspiracy theories about Freemasons, Jews, the Illuminati. There are conspiracy theories about the writings that take off from the writings of one particular person who claimed that some of the people mentioned in ancient Sumerian mythology were actually a race of extraterrestrial beings that came to Earth to mine gold 500,000 years ago. And so there's some things that get pretty far out there. The first major, what's deemed the first major conspiracy theory of the internet age was the 9/11 truther movement, where it was the U.S. government that caused all the tragedies to take place on 9/11, not Al-Qaeda, not any kind of terrorist group or anything like that. And I found interesting, considering the Super Bowl has just played, that there are quite a few conspiracy theories about the New England Patriots. And I just say that because Brady was part of some of those conspiracies. Some of you may remember that. There are some conspiracies that impact Bible truths. Conspiracy theories, I should say. There is the claim that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were lovers, and their offspring and descendants were hidden in Europe. It became a subject of a novel and a movie called The Da Vinci Code. Some of you are probably familiar with that. I remember as a child discussing some of these theories with my father, and the one that really concerned me was Sasquatch, Bigfoot, because I had woods behind my house, I had woods in front of my house, and I loved to play in the woods, and I did not want to meet up with that fella or that gal, whatever it is, I don't know. I had fascination with the Loch Ness Monster and also UFOs. Now, thankfully, my father didn't really get into the conspiratorial aspect of it as much as we were just curious. Could these things be real? It was a mystery to us, and it was a very interesting mystery. And so sometimes we see things like this, and we just wonder about it. We wonder what's the truth in some of these things. But there are conspiracies, there are alleged conspiracies, and there are conspiracy theories. And this idea is all the more in the news around us. And I think as we go through this, we'll find that the Bible shows that conspiracies and conspiracy theories are going to increase more and more as we approach the return of Jesus Christ. So I wanted to talk about that today. I want to talk about how should we as Christians view conspiracy theories. Is there a danger to them? What should we be wary of? I think, as I said, we've all had some of these things we've probably wondered about and believed. Probably every person in America has believed some conspiracy in one form or another. But is there anything we should be concerned about as we look at these things? What spiritual principles should guide us as we evaluate real truth versus professed truth? Real conspiracies versus conspiracy theories. What should guide us in this way? Now, I'm not going to it's not part of my purpose today to tell you whether any conspiracy, alleged conspiracy, or conspiracy theory is actually true or not. I don't know in many cases. Sometimes they're very interesting, but I don't have the answer, and I'm not going to pass judgment on any conspiracy theory. I will use a couple of as examples of something as we go through, but it's not my purpose to make anybody feel bad that maybe you've believed in Sasquatch like I did. I don't intend to make anybody feel bad in that way, but I do think there are some spiritual principles that we ought to consider because of the age that we live in, and the fact that conspiracies will increase, and the fact that truth will begin to be harder and harder to discern. And how important is that to us as we look forward into our future? A number of years ago, I read a book by Daniel Pipes called Conspiracy. And I actually wrote a review of it for the Ministerial Journal at the time. And I'm going to use a little bit of that information as we go through the sermon today. But his book was written back in 1997. And I want to refer to it a little bit because it's outside of the current realm of politics that we are in today. It wasn't something that was written because of Donald Trump or any other political figure. It's not something that was written because of MSNBC or Newsmax or anything. It's outside of the context of our present deliberations. And so I think it holds a little more validity because it's not influenced by some of the current what's going on currently. This is what he says. He defines a conspiracy as a group of people formed for the purpose of committing, by joint efforts, some unlawful or criminal act. Now, a conspiracy doesn't have to be illegal. It doesn't have to be, but that's the legal definition of it. Typically, a conspiracy is a group of people formed for the purpose of, by joint efforts, doing something that's considered unethical or something they don't want generally known. Pipes, in his book, he believes that conspiracies definitely exist, but he draws a distinction between a conspiracy and a conspiracy theory. He says that a conspiracy theory is the fear of a non-existent conspiracy or an unjustified perception of conspiracy. I think that probably all of us as we've gone through life have either known or seen characters in movies depicted with this kind of almost a paranoia. Everything's something else. Nothing is what it seems. There's always some evil, nefarious motive behind something, lurking behind every corner. And sometimes people can really have a paranoid spirit. And that's kind of where he approaches this, because some of the people who have developed some things that are out there have that mentality. There's something evil behind everything, and it's our job to figure out what that is, because they are not going to tell us what it is. And so he talks about that quite a bit. He says that conspiracy, a true conspiracy, is an act. It's an act. A conspiracy theory is a perception. He says the Russian Revolution was a real conspiracy carried out by Lenin and others. It was real. And it was also subject to conspiracy theories involving everyone from 18th century Illuminati to contemporary German socialists and even the elders of Zion. You'll find that historically the Jewish people are the evil people in many conspiracy theories throughout the centuries. It's oftentimes the Jews. You think all the way back to Pharaoh. He feared. He had a paranoia, you might say. He had a suspicion that this Israelite people would grow to be so strong that they would be a threat to him. So what did he do? He enslaved them. There was a kind of conspiratorial mindset. He was afraid something may be happening, that they may be able to take control. And out of that fear, he made sure that they were enslaved. That's been the case throughout much of the history, especially of the Jews, when you study into these things. Pipes also writes this. He says, paranoia is on the rise in America and the world. This was back 1997. He says, and the source of some of the most bizarre ideas ever put forward, dangerous ideas about government, UFOs, the Trilateral Commission, abound in places like the writings of Lyndon H. LaRouche and late-night talk radio, militia meetings, and especially on the internet. These ideas show up in Hollywood movies, scholarly books, and even presidential campaigns. Again, this was many years ago that this was written, but we've seen it show up more and more, even in politics. And as I said earlier, I think we will see it show up more and more as we go forward into the future as well. One of the things that I really appreciated about Daniel Pipe's book is it went into some of the history of conspiracy theory, something I had never really studied into very much. And he talks about, he writes this, he says, in its very furthest reaches, the conspiracy mentality can be traced back to dualistic religions of Iran and the mystery religions that swept the Roman Empire. You can go back all the way that far. Oftentimes it was religious things that caused these conspiratorial mindsets. He says, for the purposes of the book he's writing, he says that the Crusades marked the earliest fears about a small band seeking power through conspiratorial means. They generated a recognizable form of the conspiracism about Jews and secret societies that reigns all the way through until today. So he goes back to the Crusades, it's time when a lot of this stuff started. In fact, it's kind of interesting that so many of the conspiracy theories that are around today go all the way back for centuries. And sometimes they just put a different villain in, substitute the Jews in, or substitute the Germans in, substitute the communists in. It's the same basic conspiracy, it's just a different villain. They found that back in the days when there were a lot of conspiracy theories about the enemy that would invade from Mexico. Sometimes it was the communists, sometimes it was whoever the enemy was at the time. It was the Chinese, whomever. They just put a different evil group in there and continued the theory. It's interesting that he talks about in Europe, there were two primary strands of conspiracism, that form of secret societies, groups of people doing things secretly behind the scenes, and the other was the international Jewry, that the Jews were controlling things behind the scenes. He writes that in some countries, particularly the Soviet Union and Russia, conspiracism is very high. In fact, most Russians believe that the United States and Britain are trying to dominate the world. And they have all these conspiracies about what we're doing to take over the world. And it's interesting that many nations today view what we would say are the modern descendants of Israel with a great deal of conspiracism. There's conspiracy theories all around the world about what the United States and Britain and other English-speaking nations are doing that oftentimes drive a hatred of us. It's very real. And people, they literally hate us because of the conspiracies they've heard that Americans are involved with. And so it has a genuine effect in the minds of many people. And it probably will contribute to the mindset of the world against the Israelite nations as we go into persecution. It won't all be facts. It will be feelings brought on by conspiratorial mindsets and ideas. Fact is that the Bible does not indicate that there's some cabal of Jews controlling the world. The Jews will be some of those who are persecuted at the time of the end. But many professing Christians are actually believing that kind of thing. I got an article here I thought I would read because it touches on a little bit of what's going on in modern Christianity. And I think it's something we should all be concerned about and certainly aware of. This article, if anybody wants the actual article, I can send you the link's pretty long, so I can send it to you individually. But it says, in recent years, self-described prophets have proliferated across the country, accelerating in the stature over the course of the Trump era. They are stars within what is known as the fast-moving corners of Christianity, a loose but fervent movement led by hundreds of people who believe that they can channel supernatural powers. They have special insight into world events. This is something that's going on in the last number of years. It goes on to say that many independent evangelists who do not lead churches or other institutions operate primarily online through appearances at conferences or guest speakers at churches, making money through book sales, donations, and speaking fees. They're part of a rising appeal of conspiracies in the Christian settings, echoed by the popularity of the QAnon among many evangelicals and the resistance to mainstream sources of information. The popularity of the self-appointed prophets shows no signs of waning. As denominational Christianity declines almost across the board, magnetic, independent leaders have stepped into the void. And there's a sociologist named Brad Christensen, who is an evangelical at the Biola University. He says this. He says, there is this idea that you can't trust anybody except those trusted individuals. People put themselves out as the individual that you can trust. It goes on to say it's a symptom of our time. People don't trust institutions. People think that all mainstream institutions are corrupt. Universities, science, government, media. They're searching for real sources of truth. Now, that should concern us. Believe me, I'm just as frustrated as I know many of you are at what's given to us in the media as truth. And then sometimes we actually know it's not true, but they're peddling it as truth. And it's very frustrating. I think it's frustrating for us all. And so in one sense, people are reaching out for what can we trust? And they're individual, and sometimes they designate themselves as prophets, Christian prophets. They're filling into that void that want to be the ones that people listen to among the evangelical Christian community. This article goes on to say the result is that many congregations are awash in misinformation. Almost half of Protestant pastors frequently hear members in their congregations repeating conspiracy theories about current events. Again, I would say alleged, because some of them may turn out to be true. Who knows? But it says this is according to a recent survey by Lifeway Research. Christian prophets are meeting the hunger for reassurance and clarity that can be observed in their corners of the American culture. Astrology is exploding in popularity. Astrology, it says more than 40% of Americans now believe in psychics. All this is on the rise. People are looking for a way to put events together. What's happening? How can we understand it? I can't trust what the media is saying. I can't trust what the politicians are saying. So they reach out to somebody they think they can trust, and they start believing everything that person says. It goes on to say in this article that prophecy similarly is not only a predictive tool, but an analytical lens for making sense of past events and current events. Most successful prophets can connect seemingly disparate pieces of data into a grand narrative, adding new layers of interpretation as events unfold and inviting others to contribute. And we saw this happening among many. I won't go into all the details of that, but we saw this happening as the election was unfolding, with some of these prophets having to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. I told you that prophecy, the Bible told us this particular person was going to be president, in this case, Donald Trump. They were saying that the Bible prophesied it. And I heard even some leaders within the Church of God community saying such things. People are looking for a way to make sense of the world. And for many, because of the distrust we have in our institutions, and they have certainly made themselves where we can't trust them in many respects, but where do we look for the truth? It's very important that we consider these things. What do we believe versus what we don't believe? How much are we skeptical of what we see and read? What lens do we look through it to understand? Pipes talks about these conspiracies. He goes on to say, and I'll step away from the Christian conspiracies that are going on right now, but going back to the history of conspiracies, he talks about, actually, let me move on past that for the sake of time. There is the concept that I think that we need to consider as Christians, that is the fruit of these theories, the fruit of them. Matthew 7, verse 16 says, you shall know them by their fruits. So what is some of the fruit of some of these conspiracies? Again, looking back in history at these things, Pipes describes the horrible consequences of some of these conspiratorial mindsets. He talks about World War I and the tragedy that happened. And after World War I, after the fighting that took place, many nations considered themselves, we're pretty good people. How could this happen? How could these tragedies have happened of World War I? This happened in Germany. In particular, it happened in Russia. There was widespread suffering and anxiety, and it just created an environment that was ripe for conspiracies. And what did most people go to? The ones who must have caused all this? Well, it must have been the Jews after World War I. He writes that conspiracism reached an apex of its importance, helping to cause a magnitude of destruction unparalleled in human history. It says the conspiracist mentality had a prominent role in many of the tragedies of this period, killing millions, including the Soviet famine of 1932, the Soviet terror in 1937, and also the Jewish Holocaust. Blaming the Jews became something that was the thing to do after World War I. How could these seemingly civilized countries engage in year after year of brutal combat in the trenches? The anti-Semites had the answer. They asserted that the conflict harmed all sides except the Jews. They said that the Jews actually provoked the war. They benefited from it. They extended it, and they caused Germany to lose. The Jews had to be involved in so great a catastrophe, for no one else was as clever and ruthless. Only the Jews had ambitions so great that the war would serve their interests. And surprisingly large numbers of Europeans believed these conspiracies. It was the conspiratorial mindset that infected Adolf Hitler and caused him to so desperately hate the Jews and put so many to death. He believed, along with Nazis, and he believed these conspiracies about the Jewish people. Conspiratorial mindset has had a tremendous impact, tremendously negative impact throughout the history of mankind. And this is just more recent history. The idea that someone is engaged in some secret plot to hurt me or to hurt us is very intriguing. People tend to want to believe it against the enemy. And these things spread, and I'll get into that a little bit more about how they spread, but they've had a tremendous impact in human history and our modern history as well. With the internet, things changed all the more. There's a Wall Street Journal article by Garrett M. Graff that I read recently. It's entitled 9/11 and the Rise of New Conspiracy Theorists. He talks about having studied and written a book about the 9/11 events. And he talks about how no matter where he went, there was always some one or two people who would have the question or bring up the fact that it was the U.S. government that actually caused all this, orchestrated it or caused it to happen. There was no American Airlines Flight 77 that flew into the Pentagon. It was an American cruise missile. And he talks about how much of these self-styled 9/11 truthers, are really the first major American conspiracy theory of the digital age. He says in his article, over the centuries, many Americans have heeded the siren song of conspiracy theories based on the supposedly nefarious influence of Catholics, Masons, Jews, or communists. But the 9/11 conspiracists have been something new. Those bent on pinning 9/11 on the U.S. rather than Al-Qaeda combine a small but fanatical in-person movement with the supercharged presence of social media. Their outlandish theories aren't peddled in hard-to-find places or secret self-published screeds. They are broadcast online with slick graphics and charts. And so we see one of the reasons I think we can read a scripture soon about how conspiracies are going to increase as the end time approaches. We see that anybody can get anything out there. Anybody can publish anything and make it look really good, make it look very truthful. Years ago, I became very disappointed in the History Channel because they started having shows that promoted so much stuff that really wasn't history. It's just speculation on things. And I didn't like that very much. I became disappointed. But that was even before social media as we know it today. So we have a brand new environment with the internet and social media that allows for any kind of theory, no matter how much it's based in fact or untruths, completely made up stories. It can proliferate very easily. And we have people in this world and in this nation that have a proclivity to believe these things. It's actually, there's a science behind it. I won't get into all that, but there are types of people who tend to believe in any kind of paranoia, any kind of suspicious thing. They're automatically suspicious, overly suspicious of everything. I've got a couple terms here I thought I would give you. I think there's a distinction between someone who's overly suspicious of everything, almost a paranoia. There's a difference between that and having an intelligent skepticism. Intelligent skepticism is what we need. Whether we're listening to MSNBC or Fox News, an intelligent skepticism to evaluate what am I hearing? Why are they saying it that way? What is the real truth here? An intelligent skepticism or healthy skepticism is good, but an overriding suspicion can make us vulnerable to things that perhaps are not true. And we're going to talk about whether that overriding suspicion is a healthy mindset for Christians at any rate. But Pipes talks about how there are two groups of people who tend to be susceptible to the conspiratorial mindset. The first one is the politically disaffected. We certainly see that in the world today, both sides. It doesn't matter which side you're on. Take the last two elections. The politically disaffected comes up with all these theories about what must have happened that the other side won. And so we see conspiracies thrown around. The other group of people is the culturally suspicious. Those who are suspicious about what's going on in society. Now, I think in one sense, we fall under both these categories in some ways. As God's people, we recognize that politically, this world's not going to work. Christ is going to come, set everything straight. There's a lot of stuff wrong with the politics of this world and this nation. We also are the culturally suspicious. We see the morality of this nation heading downhill fast. Bothers us. We don't like it. And so in one sense, we ourselves could fall into this susceptibility. I think it's important for us to consider as we go through this today. I want to talk about some of the reasons why conspiracies start and tend to perpetuate themselves, and give us some things to think about in terms of our thinking as we think about these things. The first thing that I have, what starts and perpetuates conspiracy theories, I've just got this: hate, disparage, and destroy thy enemy. Hate, disparage, and destroy thy enemy. This is one of the great motivations throughout history of theories, of conspiratorial theories about the enemy. As I mentioned, the Jews have long been villains of conspiracy theories because they were oftentimes seen as the enemy. You have to hate, if you hate them, then you have to disparage them. You have to make them look like they're terrible people. And then once you do that, you have a greater ability to destroy them, whether it's destroy them, their reputation, and whether it's to literally destroy them. That hatred turns into disparaging them, painting them in the worst possible light, which causes more people to hate them all the more. That is one of the primary motivations of conspiracy theories throughout the ages. I want to take for an example here. Again, I'm not going to give my opinion about this particular recent conspiracy, but I just want to use it as an example here. The modern QAnon conspiracy, some of you probably are aware of that, some of you may not be. But it's basically an ardent right-wing group that believes that former President Donald Trump was under assault by Satan-worshiping pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking ring, and they're part of the deep state undermining Trump. Now, I say that, I think anyone could think it's reasonable that there are people involved in government who want to undermine Trump. That's fine. But to paint them as Satan-worshiping pedophiles running a global child sex trafficking ring, wow, can't get much more disparaging than that, can you? Now again, if these are Satan-worshiping pedophiles running a child sex ring, they should be prosecuted. I don't support that. But I don't know. But I give this as an example of how you can really vilify somebody. And that's what a lot of these conspiracies do. They really make a group of people seem like they're the worst people you can imagine. It's disparaging them. Now, this QAnon group, they have been waiting for two main events to happen, the storm and the Great Awakening. The storm would be the mass arrests of high-profile people who are involved in all this illegal activity. And that was supposed to happen before Trump left office. The Great Awakening would be the realization that everyone in the world that QAnon theory was right, that they were correct. And this will allow society to enter into an age of utopia. So it's kind of and interestingly, there were a lot of evangelicals falling for at least parts of this. I'm not saying they fell for the whole thing. But again, I don't know. Is there this ring of people? I don't know. That's something that would have to be investigated and found out. But are we inclined to jump on board to say that, oh, these people are evil Satan worshipers, child sex ring? You know, part of this actually caused a man to go into a pizza place. If you've heard of the Pizzagate scenario, carrying a gun into a pizza place in Washington to investigate the child sex ring that supposedly was taking place there. Thankfully, he was arrested before he shot anybody. But these theories cause some people to take drastic action because they believe that they are true. This hate, disparage, and destroy, this attitude has caused much destruction. And it's interesting that some of the adherents of this particular theory have, in the last few weeks, given it up, saying they felt they were duped by all this. It was a big thing, and still is in the news. And we see this hate, disparage, and destroy activity all around us in the political world today. Almost anything and everything is conspiracy. The second thing that causes these things to come about and helps them perpetuate is fear. Fear. As Pipes would say, the paranoid mindset. I think I like the idea a little more of using the overriding suspicious mindset. I think that a lot of these theories probably start from the paranoid, but they are picked up by those who have an overriding suspicion of all the things that are probably going on that we don't know, the bad things, and they're suspicious of everything. In the most recent Discern magazine, Joel Meeker wrote an article about how to overcome fear. And he talked about Chapman University research. He says Chapman University research that highlighted levels of fear are linked to the increased belief in conspiracy theories. The higher one's level of fear, the more conspiracy theories one is likely to believe. Again, I think even in what we've already talked about, you can see how it's very easy for people to fear someone like the Pharaoh fearing the increased population of the Israelites and his willingness to believe there was something nefarious that could be going on and taking that action. The paranoia, the unnecessary, unreasonable concern about something that doesn't or may not exist or is simply not true. That's another description, the kind of fear that some feel. Another description, the excessive or irrational suspiciousness and distrustfulness of others. And doing some research on this sermon, I was looking at some YouTube videos and how some people really do fear the black SUV that their neighbor drives. Are they spying on them? Some people get into such irrational fears. They live at home in fear that someone is looking at them, investigating them. And there are those who have this. Now, sometimes it's mental illness. Sometimes it can be the side effects of medications even. Sometimes we'll say paranoia. It could be any number of things, but as you can imagine, it would be very unpleasant to live with that kind of mindset. But some have that and are very quick to be able to find nefarious motives and actions in almost anything, secret things that no one else knows, but they've figured out themselves. I want to go back to Leviticus 23. I think this is an important verse as we think about our future. We have the blessings and cursings. And one of the curses is mentioned here. What will happen back then to the Israelites, but I think it certainly applies in our age today as well. Leviticus chapter 26. Leviticus 26. Leviticus 26, verse 36. It says, "And for those of you who are left, I will send faintness into their hearts, and in the lands of their enemies. The sound of a shaking leaf shall cause them to flee." Notice that fear, a shaking leaf. Oh, there's something bad. It will cause them to flee. "They shall flee as though they're fleeing from a sword, and they shall fall down when no one pursues." There's this paranoia, this fear. Verse 37, "They shall stumble over one another, as it were before a sword, when no one pursues." We have this concept described of a nation that will become this fearful. And when there is fear, there are all kinds of things to create stories about. In this case, the shaking leaf, the shaking leaf conspiracy. But you see that prophetically, we will likely enter into more and more of this kind of fear, this paranoia, this over-suspicion of every little thing that's happening. It's one of the curses. And as our nation gets more and more, falls further and further from God, these are the kind of fears we can expect to see in the media, in politics. But should we have that kind of fear? Should we be shaking at every potential nefarious action? If you look at world events today, anything, and I might dare say everything, every significant event that happens in the world, there is a conspiracy behind it. Because someone thinks that it's not what it seems. What we're being told can't be true. There must be something else going on. They'll try to connect dots here and there and plots and various things and come up with a theory. It will happen with everything as we go forward into the future. COVID-19 has plenty of conspiracy theories. Who started it? I don't know. But for some people, they know exactly. China, it's us. In China, our military brought COVID-19 to their country. And many Chinese believe that. It's a conspiracy theory. In America, there's all kinds of conspiracies about where it might have originated from. I really don't know. I know what the, quote, experts tell me, but I know that there's some reason to doubt them. So what do we believe? The fact is, I don't need to know where COVID-19 came from to be in the kingdom. God knows where it came from, and that's good enough for me. But I think we have to be careful not to fall for things that we don't know if it's true. We don't know. Sometimes there are agendas behind some of these things that are motivating people. We don't have to live this way. We don't have to live our lives with this curse. If you go back to 2 Timothy 1 verse 7, a well-known verse to us that I think is very important in this context. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 7. "For God has not given us a spirit of fear." We have God's Spirit. We don't have to flee at the shaking of a leaf. We don't have to wonder what bad things happening is being hidden from us that might affect us in some way. We don't have to worry. God's Spirit is not the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. I think those three things are important as well. Power. Many people, when they feel fear, they feel powerless. There are secret societies controlling everything that's going on around us. We're out of control. We don't have power. But God's Spirit gives us. It is a spirit of power. We don't have to feel powerless in the wake of events that are going around us. Love. We're going to talk about this a little bit more as we go through as well. But oftentimes, again, these conspiratorial mindsets, it's hatred at certain people, whether it's an individual or a group of people. We are to have love. God's Spirit gives us that. And of a sound mind. There are some conspiracy theories out there that they're so implausible. We'll talk about why in just a little bit, but it's just not sound-mindedness. God's Spirit gives us this. So we don't have to have that spirit of fear that we'll find the world has more and more. So that's the second thing that creates and also perpetuates various conspiracy theories. Again, I'm not talking about conspiracies that may be true, the alleged conspiracy that hasn't been fleshed out yet, but these conspiracies that tend to last for years and go on and on. The third thing that causes people to create and perpetuate these things is a desire for secret knowledge. Desire for secret knowledge. Mr. Meeker's article, he talks about Gnosticism, this secret knowledge that the New Testament church had to deal with. Christians who were coming into the church and bringing these Gnostic ideas, false teachers bringing this Gnosticism. He says that one of the challenges of the Christian church faced in the first century was the belief that came to be known as Gnosticism. Gnosis is the Greek word for knowledge. Gnosticism is the claim that some people had secret knowledge into which one had to be initiated in order to know the whole truth. This is, in essence, a conspiracy theory type thing, drawing people in to secret knowledge that many others don't know, but it will help you understand the truth. And the New Testament writers fought against this. Both Paul and John fought against this mentality. It was something they dealt with in Colossians and other epistles. We have to be careful because we have knowledge that God has opened our mind to. I don't like to call it secret knowledge, but it is knowledge that God's Spirit has opened us to understand. We see the Bible, we read it for what it says. It's there for everybody to see and read. It's not secret, but the willingness to live our lives by it and the willingness to truly understand it for all that it says comes from God's Spirit opening our minds. It's not a conspiratorial thing. And yet I think over the years we have seen some people came into the church because perhaps of a desire to understand prophecy, what's going to happen. And of course, I think most of us have that desire. But for some people, it was perhaps overblown. They just wanted to know what secret things were going to happen between now and Christ's return. And there was a certain level of satisfaction or pride that one might have in just knowing these secret things. And some people really have a desire to know the secret things. The Bible says the secret things belong to God. There are certain questions that we won't find the answers to. There are some things that only God will know. The secret things belong to God. But for some people, they're drawn to what is secret, what has been hidden. And for them, they want to understand that. And they become part of an initiated group of people who believes the things that most people don't accept. And they feel special in that way. And I think it's important for us to understand we are called a special people because God has called us. God has opened our minds. Not because there's some secret knowledge. It's in the Bible. The whole world can see it. But we understand it because of God's help. But again, we have to be careful because sometimes even we could be drawn into this idea. We are used to believing unconventional ideas. We're here today rather than tomorrow. We keep holy days, not holidays. And we're used to being in that category of people who believe unconventional things. And so it can be very easy for us to extend that into other unconventional areas that aren't spiritual, but are related to conspiracism and that type of thing. Let's move on to point number 4. Point number 4, these people who create these conspiracies and propagate them, they have a proclivity to ignore truth. Some truth, let's say. They have a proclivity to ignore some truth, and rather they want to believe the enticing, elaborate stories. They want to believe enticing, elaborate stories of intrigue, inhumanity, and in some cases, outright deception. I'll just read that one more time. The proclivity to ignore truth, and rather believe enticing, elaborate stories of intrigue, inhumanity, and deception. Just imagine some of the things we've heard. You can put whoever's name you want to because different names have been thrown into these categories. But people automatically assume that someone else is evil. And, for example, someone perhaps who's rich and powerful may be controlling the events of what's going on, may have created this coronavirus so that they can benefit from it. Put whoever's name you want in there. I'm sure several names have been put in there on the internet and various people. This person, whoever it is rich, powerful, famous, probably created the virus, certainly profiting from it. Is it Christian to assume someone could be that evil, or is that evil? Just because they're rich and powerful, are they a legitimate target for a Christian? Now, maybe these people, whoever they are evil. I don't know. But is it Christian for me to assume they're evil and to believe something? I will say this, it's one thing to believe something's possible. It is certainly possible. But to believe it's true, have I lowered my bar of truth to the level that just because someone may be evil, may have had the capacity, that I believe they are evil? I just can't see, when I think about that, I see the plausibility, but I don't want to be that person who automatically assumes the evil. Just because they're rich, just because they're powerful, just because they have an opportunity, does it mean they create it? Does it mean that they're going to subject their elderly parents, their kids and grandkids, to this uncontrollable thing just for money? And in some cases, they've given away far more money than they'll ever make on the virus, so it's questionable as to whether that can be legitimate. That's what some of us want to believe, these enticing stories of, in this case, inhumanity. Who would do such a thing? Not saying there aren't people who might. Not saying it's not possible, but for me to assume that. Let's go back to Philippians chapter 4. We should have a high bar for truth, brethren. We do spiritually. We prove the Sabbath. Why do we read something sometimes? It's easy to read. I've done it myself. Read something that some guy, I don't even know who he is, on the internet wrote and think, well, that sounds like it could be true. Suddenly my bar for truth has gone way down. I don't know this person's fruits. You shall judge them by their fruits. All I know is there's the possibility of a nefarious, evil intrigue that sounds interesting. Philippians 4 verse 8 says, brethren, whatever things are true. Again, what is our bar for truth? If the political party that we're more inclined to believe in says that the opposing party is doing such and such, even though it may sound rather outlandish, do we believe it just because we want to believe it? Is it true because it's plausible? Again, I acknowledge that finding truth is hard in today's world, but we do have the truth we need, for sure. And we can be passionate about that truth. We may acknowledge some things may be true, but do we believe them to be true? It says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are noble. Some of these conspiracy theories are the most ignoble things that you can imagine, especially looking through history. Whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report. If there's any virtue, if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. This is our admonition. And this goes against so much of what we see in the world today, doesn't it? We don't see people in the media focusing on these things. We had the trial going on this week, and it was very frustrating. But you see all these accusations going back and forth. We live in a world that wants to focus on anything but these things. But as Christians, this is what we should focus on. And oftentimes, the conspiratorial mindset is the opposite of what it says here in Philippians. Point number 5, I've mentioned it already, but one of the reasons these theories get perpetuated and continue on is because of a low threshold of truth. For some people, there's a very low threshold of truth. And I'll just use one example that Mr. Meeker brings out, and I read it in another article as well. This Chapman University survey found that it surveyed different theories people believe, and it found that 32% of Americans, that's 1 in 3 basically of Americans, believe the U.S. government is not telling the truth about the South Dakota air crash. Now, you've probably heard about the South Dakota air crash by now. There wasn't one. I mean, I'm sure airplanes have crashed in South Dakota, but the conspiracy that the government's covering up information about the South Dakota air crash. They made this one up for the survey, just to see who would believe something that they've never heard anything about, that there is absolutely no evidence of. And 1 in 3 Americans have such an overtly suspicious mind that if it's anything negative about the government, they'll believe it. It's true. And I think it shows an incredibly low threshold for truth. It's basing truth on what might be true, what I suspect could be true. It's basing truth on my fears. I fear that they're covering things up. And it is a terrible threshold. It just blows my mind that people would answer that. I mean, I understand why, because we have suspicions about our government. But to believe something, and when there's no evidence and you've never even heard about it, our threshold for truth in America is very, very low. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21, I'll just give it to you as a reference. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 21. Prove all things, as the King James says. New King James, test all things and hold fast to that which is good. We should desire something to be provable if we're going to believe it. And just because you can't disprove something doesn't mean it's true. Just because you can't prove that ghosts don't exist doesn't mean ghosts exist. You have to be careful what logic we use in these things. But people's threshold for truth and their logic is oftentimes not there. Let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 13. I think this is an important scripture with regard to conspiracy, because there was an accusation of a conspiracy against God and His truth. They didn't use the word conspiracy, but that's what it was. In Deuteronomy chapter 13 and verse 12, I think it teaches us a very important lesson about what we believe and what we don't believe. What we believe may be true, but we don't accept it as truth because we don't know. I would say in a lot of these things, I don't know. But I don't want to accept it as truth, believe it to be true, until I have substantial evidence and have heard both sides, which is very unlikely in so much of what's going on today. Notice Deuteronomy 13. If you hear someone in one of your cities, which the Lord your God gives you to dwell in, saying, corrupt men, evil, corrupt men, have gone out from among you and enticed the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known. These evil guys are going out from over here in Hebron. They're going out and they're trying to get people to turn on God. Really? Boy, that's pretty bad. And I believe those people in Hebron would do that kind of thing. They're evil. I've heard other stories about them. Yep. God says, then you shall put them to death. Verse 14. No, just kidding. Notice the reaction to this accusation of conspiracy against God. It says, then you shall inquire, search out, and ask diligently. And if it is indeed true, then they were to take action. But notice this was to be a very formidable investigation. It wasn't just to be believed because they're a different tribe. That's where we are in today's society. If it's a different party, if it's a different group of people that we don't agree with, it must be true. It says here we are to inquire, search out, and ask diligently. Then we believe it if it's found to be true. Now, the fact is, for so much of what we hear today in the news, it's conspiratorial in nature. We can't do that, can we? We just don't have the capacity to call a trial. We don't have it. So we just have to accept that I don't know. Could be true. Hope it's not true. But I'm not going to believe something is true unless it reaches a standard. And if it doesn't reach that standard, I can simply say, I don't know. Hopefully, law enforcement will check out these allegations of these the evil rings in Washington, and find out if it is true. And if it is true, upon deliberations in court and hearing both sides, then I might say, okay, I believe that. I believe it happened. But, we have to honor our governmental authorities. Bible tells us we're to do that. And they have the authority to investigate these things. And maybe they don't. Maybe there's corruption. Maybe there's bribery. Maybe there's cover-ups. It happens. Absolutely. But is it our responsibility to assume it's happening? Some of you may have seen the movie starring Mel Gibson, Conspiracy Theory. It came out years and years ago. One of my favorite quotes, Mel Gibson, the character there, he says this: a good conspiracy is unprovable. I mean, if you can prove it, it means they screwed up somewhere along the line. And so, in his mind, the fact that you can't prove it means it's true. And what kind of logic is that? But that is the logic of so many in this world. If it's a real conspiracy, you won't be able to prove it because they are hiding information. We're going to talk about some of the ways, as we close here, some of the ways to recognize a conspiracy theory. But one of the things that was brought up by Daniel Pipes in his book was the idea of the JFK assassination. It was a problem for one of the gentlemen who was creating this theory. And he quotes one of the fellows who assisted him at the time when he was propagating his theories of the assassination. And that guy said that what if he ran into something that there was not an answer for, he just ignored it or said it was a cover-up. And for example, the idea that the doctors didn't find enough bullets in JFK's body to go along with one of the conspiracy theories. What did he say? He said, he created another conspiracy theory. The doctors hid them. So one conspiracy, once the facts come in, facts that supposedly shoot it down, you create another conspiracy on top of it. Now the doctors are involved. And it just goes on and on. Let's talk about, very briefly, some of these ways to recognize a conspiracy theory. Now, let's be honest. Some conspiracy theories, things that have been thought to be conspiracy theories in the past, have shown themselves to be true. Sometimes that happens. So we have to be open to that possibility. But these are the things that typically denote conspiracy theory. And I've got some from Pipes I won't go through, but I've got another from an article in Scientific American back in 2010. It says there are conspiracies. We can't just dismiss them out of hand. But these are some of the things to look for. Number one, proof of a conspiracy supposedly emerges from a pattern of connecting the dots between events that need not be causally connected. In other words, there's no real reason to connect them, but someone puts them together. Another one is agents behind the pattern of conspiracies would need to be nearly superhuman in power to pull them off, have tremendous influence and power that most people simply don't have. The fact is, if you look historically, Pipes points this out, most conspiracies fail. If you have three guys in a conspiracy to undermine the dictator, one of them gets in his mind that if I reveal the conspiracy, I'm going to be thought of as the savior, and reveals it. I mean, it's just somebody's going to know that they can get ahead by revealing it. So most conspiracies fail. And it goes on to say the conspiracy is complex, and its successful completion demands a large numbers of elements and things to work out just right. It's not likely to be true. Another point, similarly, conspiracies involving large numbers of people who would need to keep silent about their secrets. That's oftentimes some of the large conspiracy theories requires that. Another point is it encompasses a grand ambition for control over a nation, an economy, or a political system. If it suggests domination, the theory is less likely to be true. Another point, the conspiracy often assigns sinister meanings and motives to what may just be innocuous or inconsequential events. Sinister motives. Another point, the theory tends to commingle facts and speculations without really drawing much distinction between what is fact and what is speculation. Another point, theorists are indiscriminately suspicious of all government agencies and private groups. There's this overriding suspicion behind these things. And the final point is the conspiracy theorist tends to refuse to consider alternate explanations. They get their mindset on one thing, and everything has to be put together to fit that. Are there dangers to the conspiratorial mindset? Certainly taken to an extreme, I think we can see that there would be. One of Hollywood's most renowned movie producers, Oliver Stone, he asked these questions. He said, at one time he said, who owns your reality? Who owns reality? Who owns your mind? He says, I've come to have severe doubts about Columbus, about Washington, about the Civil War being fought over slavery. He says, I don't even know if I was born or who my parents really were. This suspicion, think of how far it can take a person. And even affect our faith. There's the gospel of Judas that came out. The idea that Christ actually talked Judas into turning him in. Some of these conspiracies are deeply religious. In fact, those who are deeply rooted in conspiracism and conspiracy theories even claim that all religion, even the Bible, is based on a controlled secret society. This is not inspired by God. There's a secret society that put it out. How far does this go? I had a conversation recently with a gentleman who was interested in the church, but it kind of went sideways very quickly once we got to the fact that the gospel that needs to be preached to everyone here is that if you take the vaccine, that is the mark of the beast and you will burn forever in hell. He wanted to come and tell you all that, and I asked him not to. And then I ended the call when finally he simply said that the government has learned to control time. And they've gone back and they've changed the Bible. And I said, well, if they changed it, they didn't do a very good job because what we believe is still there. But he believed that the government had gone back in time. And how far does this irrationality go? This man was so suspicious of everything that it became, I was hearing things I've never heard in my life. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 3. I realize I'm going a little more than I want to, but let's see the time. I'm not technically over time, but further than I wanted to go. Genesis chapter 3, it's interesting that this idea of a conspiratorial mindset was present when Satan deceived Eve. And I think that's one of the important reasons that we should be considerate of how we allow our minds to think and how Satan might take advantage of us. Not only now, but in the future, going forward, and things that we have no idea are coming. Details of current or future events that are on the horizon that we might be susceptible of believing some things that lead us the wrong direction. Notice in Genesis 3, verse 2, and the woman said to the serpent, we may eat of the trees of the fruit of the garden, fruit trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, you shall not touch it, lest you die. And the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. God's not telling you the truth. He's hiding something from you. It says, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. There's a conspiracy to withhold information. God's not telling you the whole story. I've got more to the story. I think it's very interesting and sobering that this mindset is exactly the mindset that Satan used to deceive Eve. He knew what he was doing. He knew that the intriguing story that God had something else going on, that he wasn't acting in her best interest, that he had a secret, and this secret knowledge could be yours. Just eat of this tree. It parallels so much some of the conspiratorial mindset that we see in the world today, and I think it's one of the reasons we should be very, very careful about going down that road. One thing that we should consider too is that let's conclude back in Isaiah chapter 12. God gives us a direct admonition here to be careful about conspiracies. Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 12 and 13. And it gives us some comfort, too, as we face these times that we live in. Sometimes people are just trying to put together a narrative that makes sense to them. And that's why they fall for some of these things. It helps them make sense of the world. Notice what it says here, Isaiah 8, verse 12. Do not call a conspiracy everything that these people call a conspiracy. We're not to believe conspiracies that other people believe. We're not supposed to call something conspiracy that people in the world call a conspiracy. Because there will be more and more of it. It says, do not fear what they fear. And do not dread it. So many conspiracies are based on fear, suspicion, and dread. He says, don't do that. Do not call a conspiracy everything that these people call a conspiracy. Do not fear what they fear. Do not dread it. The Lord Almighty is the one you are to regard as holy. He is the one you are to fear. He is the one you are to dread. Our fear is of God. What happens in this world, whether it's real conspiracies, alleged conspiracies, or conspiracy theories, God is in control. No group of people sitting somewhere under the Denver airport is going to control what happens in this world beyond what God is able to do. And we can have complete faith in that. So I'll just conclude by saying this. Let's not assume the worst in people to be true. Let's not assume the worst in government to always be true. Let's not be guided by a paranoia or a suspicious fear. Be guided by truth. Let's not be lured in by secret, little known knowledge. Let's not be enticed by intriguing stories. Let's have a high bar for what we accept to be truth. And let's remember that ultimately, no matter what real conspiracies might happen, God is in charge.